And I'll just do the remaining things that I need to do to get this all set up. And now we're ready to go. And I don't know if you've seen the schedule or not, but what I am proposing to do is a lecture series that really takes us in the direction of philosophy, cognitive science, brain science, and to really focus on what we understand about how the human mind and human brain work, and in part because we're about to suffer an onslaught of electioneering news, of trials of a former president, and a war unfolding in the Ukraine, more and more extreme weather events. I don't know if you can see that the light in my room today is a little off because of the haze in the air in the New York City area. Well, there's a lot of stuff, the pandemic, etc., that we do need to talk about, and that I promise you we will dedicate future sessions to. But there's also, I think, some relevance to the issues I want to speak with you about under the rubric of thinking about thinking. And at the same time, it's less pressing, it's less immediate. It may be a nice detour away from what's gripping us in the headlines, and at the same time, a window into maybe some issues that are of deeper relevance to us. So I start the overall class with an image, and this is Giuseppe Ribera, who's a Spanish Enlightenment philosopher, I'm sorry, Spanish Renaissance painter, who has painted philosopher with mirror. And this is his image of Socrates. And part of why I start with this image is because this is, I think, a classical image of how we think about thinking, right? And that is that we simply reflect upon ourselves, that we have no other tool but our own capacity for self-reflection, for turning reason back in upon itself. And that is what Socrates was doing. Note that this is a little anachronistic in the sense that there weren't mirrors in 4th century BCE Greece. You had to look in a still pool of water if you wanted to see how you looked. But having said that, this idea of a direct, reflective understanding of self as being the core of the Western and other philosophical traditions as well. I'll point out to you, I'm really going to focus almost exclusively on Western philosophical traditions. That's not a value judgment about the relative importance of different traditions. It's just my qualification. I want to speak with you about what I know, and what I know well is the Western tradition and much less other traditions. And so the basic outline, I guess I've got another slide and another image. This will be the today's lecture, which is basically introductory, but also a little bit of a historical interview of thinking about thinking. And I start, of course, with the famous Rodin sculpture of the thinker. I would point out, I don't know if you know the history of this image, but he struggled a little bit to get this image right. And in the end, he shifted the right elbow from the right knee to the left knee. And his reason for doing so was to try to create more torque, more dynamism in the torso of his thinker and in the overall impression that it creates. And the idea is that thought is dynamic, that this man standing perfectly still, perfect isolation, actually has a whirlwind unfurling in his mind, right? And so the first thing to note is that we are where we are. We are the dominant species on the planet. We have multiplied in a way that seemed inconceivable even 100 years ago. We've extended our lifespan maybe you've seen the news that we've actually altered the axis of the spin of the planet. The poles are shifting because we're melting the ice caps and draining the aquifers and groundwater. We are the dominant species on the planet because of our capacity for thought, not because of our strength, not because of our aggression or physical capacities, but because we have evolved the capacity to communicate, which has allowed us to do more and more complex forms of social interaction, to preserve our knowledge in writing, to pass it down in culture. We rely on thought more than anything else. Yet, I want to also suggest that the further we get into thinking about thinking, the more this image will be, I think, revealed to be misleading in the sense that it's not a solitary activity. It's not the person chin on hand in the quiet of some field putting their thoughts together. Yes, that's important, but the reason we think the way we think, when our reason operates best, tends to be intersubjective, interpersonal, in social context, using social resources. And so in this sense, at least the conventional artistic representation of thinking may be misleading. I'm currently conceiving of this as a 6 installments, starting today and stretching through the beginning of August. I will obviously come up for air and interrupt this series if there are really significant things that we need to talk about in the news. And my basic plan here is to start with philosophy, move into more psychological and neuroscientific approaches, and then to come back to philosophy on the basis of what I hope will be a richer understanding. Having said that, let me just point out to you as a kind of promissory note that we've now seen this Supreme Court come to completion. I think many of us are thinking right now about the student loan decision, this major questions doctrine, which kind of has been fabricated by this court out of nowhere, striking down important student loan and environmental protection issues. We're obviously thinking about the end of affirmative action and the weaponization of the Equal Protection Clause. At least that's the way I would describe it, to in a sense, completely overturned roughly 60 years of precedent that had been argued for under the auspices of the Equal Protection Clause. And yet I think we also have to note that some of the things that I think many liberals, Democrats, constitutional law scholars feared most, that the Supreme Court would further invalidate the Voting Rights Act, or that it would embrace a truly radical doctrine about state legislatures' supreme authority over voting law. Those worst case scenarios were divided. Two more things to say very quickly here. Clearly, this remains, in ways that I talked with you about after Dobbs, after the decision overturning the right to abortion, a extreme Supreme Court, a radical Supreme Court, a supremacist Supreme Court, in the sense that they think that they are the only arbiters of the Constitution, and they don't care very much for the popularity or unpopularity of their decision. So that's still the case, I think, as we see, especially with these 4 decisions. But I would also ask you to recognize, right? We have several decisions here where it's really the conservative bloc that is controlling this court, but we have at least a couple decisions here where the three liberal members were able to find enough support from the more conservative members to be able to be in the majority. And so it may be that this is a slight moderation from what some people had expected. Final thing to note very quickly is that these decisions are actually not nearly as unpopular with the country as a whole as, say, overturning Dobbs. And so the idea that we talked about last year, that the Supreme Court is a minoritarian institution imposing the views of a minority who elects a president, elects the majority of the Senate, who in turn constitute the Supreme Court, and then the court comes to reflect their views and not the majority views, seems actually perhaps a little bit less of an issue in this term than it was in the previous term. But this is a promissory note to say there's a lot to talk about here. I imagine it must be on your minds. We will come back to it at a different occasion. But today, I want to kick off this new course, and I want to talk with you about my motivations so you understand where I'm coming from and wanting to teach it. And the first motivations are intellectual. This has to do with the fact that there's just been an avalanche, both in philosophy, but especially in cognitive science, neuroscience, brain science, psychology, over the last, I want to say 20 to 30 years. We've really become much more advanced in our understanding of what's going on in the brain, but also what seems to be going on at an unconscious level in the mind. So the brain refers to, right, the physiological, the neurochemical and electrical structures of this organ up here contained in the cranium, right? And the mind refers to what we do with it, the way our thought process is rooted in the brain, but nevertheless may not be reducible to the brain, both our conscious and unconscious forms of thought. And in both respects, brain and mind, the last, let's say, quarter century has really given us quite profound breakthroughs. And so I'm interested in talking about what we're learning about ourselves, because we're learning more. We seem to have a better handle than we have had for a long time. We are deepening some of our traditional or classical understandings, but we are also problematizing or calling into question some of the received wisdom of ages as we have a better understanding of the structure, the operation and processes of the brain, as well as new scientific methods for understanding the thought process the brain structures. So exciting material. I hope you will find it fascinating. But there's a second, more practical motivation for the course. And I have on the board here 3 images of thinking. And I'm using one of my favorite philosophers, Hannah Arendt, as a kind of jumping off point for suggesting to you that the third decade of the 21st century is a really important time to be thinking about thinking, because, as Arendt suggested 50 years ago, modern social conditions and culture may, in certain respects, be hostile to thinking. And we need to, if that's the case, get as much clarity as possible about where that hostility comes from and what we might possibly be able to do to counter it. So my first image is Hannah Arendt, and a kind of classical image of Arendt lost in thought, is at least the way I read that image. And there she is alone with her shadow, right? And so this idea that solitude, that concentration, that an undistracted space for reflection is a precondition for thought, it seems to me, is one of the important ideas that emerges from Arendt, and she herself represents it. And then I have an image from about 10 years ago, and kind of 21st century thinker, again, chin on hand, but what's he got in front of him? A screen, right? What's he thinking about? He's not thinking in solitude, he's thinking in some sort of networked communication system, right? And then I've got the 2020s version of it, my friend holding his cell phone. And so another screen, but at this point, a ubiquitous screen, not one, right, like this man where you've got to sit down at your desk and stare at it. This one walks around in your pocket and bothers you if you don't pay attention to it, and in a sense comes to train you to pay more or less constant attention to it. And so one can only speculate whether Hannah Arendt, if she had lived into the 2020s, would look more like this man or would have continued to maintain her highly disciplined habits of research and thought. I'm inclined to think it would be the second, but I'm also inclined to think that had Hannah Arendt been maybe 15 years old in 2023, she may never have become Hannah Arendt because she never would have developed the habits of thought and discipline that allowed her to be such a productive thinker. So now let me concentrate for a minute on the actual critique that Arendt articulates and why I think it's relevant to us in the current decade. I'm going to start with her first major book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was published actually in 3 volumes in the 1950s. It's a reaction, obviously, to the rise of Hitler and Stalin, the descent of modern 20th century Europe into totalitarian forms of rule, not only in Germany and Russia. For those of you who don't know, Arendt is German, Jewish. She escaped Nazi Germany barely. There's a famous interview with an SS officer where she just barely gets out of the country. She then goes to France and eventually settles in America. And so she, among other things, is absolutely captivated by the question, how could this happen to Germany? And for what it's worth, Arendt is a student of and eventually a lover of perhaps the greatest German philosopher of the first half of the 20th century, Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger himself becomes a Nazi and one of the leaders of the effort to give intellectual credibility to Nazism. So her motivations are both personal and intellectual. And in her book on the origins of totalitarianism, she gives a very complex, thorough account. As I say, it's really 3 books integrated into one. And it starts with the practice of European colonialism and how Europeans learned both brutal techniques for ethnic rule and racism from their colonial enterprises and then brought them home in the first third of the 20th century. How this idea of an ethno-national state and the combination of that idea with self-determination under the League of Nations gave rise to this project of, as the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires broke up, constituting specific ethno-national states and then cleansing those states of residual non-majority ethnic members. How this eventually gave rise to new techniques for the exercise of state power, with the idea of totalitarianism literally referring to a total state, a state that closes down all independent sources of power, association, or reflection, how ultimately totalitarianism operates by isolating the individual from everyone else, making them lonely and powerless and uncertain about the very content of their own thoughts. And so obviously, Arendt suggests that these are barbarous, murderous regimes that ultimately plunge Europe into perhaps the most destructive war in human history. And yet she also concludes that the evil of totalitarianism is not limited to the Holocaust, the final solution, the war, the tremendous casualties, Stalin's liquidation of peasants and construction of the Gulag system. It's also to be found in the complete isolation and loneliness, the distortion of thought of individuals who were not persecuted, who survived this time, that this was a miserable deformation of human nature, even when it wasn't necessarily murderous. And this leads to, and I'm suggesting two pairings of books by Arendt, a second book that she writes in the late 1950s, publishes in the early 1960s, called The Human Condition. And in The Human Condition, Arendt develops an alternative account. And here we begin to get Arendt doing the work that she's most associated with, which is criticizing the philosophy, but also the culture of the West for lacking categories to adequately allow thought to understand and articulate itself. She suggests in particular that there's a distinction between labor, work, and action. Those are the three fundamental categories of what she calls the human condition. And the idea is that sometimes we do things that have to be done again and again and again. We cook a meal, we clean up afterwards, and when we're done, yes, we've enjoyed the meal, but we got to get up tomorrow and do it all over again, right? That's labor. Whereas for her work actually builds something permanent that actually reshapes the world such that once that it's done, it doesn't have to be done again for a very long time. It gives us an impression of our capacity to durably shape the world to be a human world. And action, third, is a kind of collective activity where we are free to decide how we are going to structure our life together, what our shared purposes are going to be, what particular activities, campaigns, laws, aims we're going to embrace here and now. And Arendt's suggestion is that the failure to distinguish labor from work from action has led us to become a consumer society of disposable goods and to not develop the capacity for judgment and freedom and self-creation, but also the respect for diversity and the equality of fellow citizens that action cultivates. And her romantic attraction to the ancient Greeks and the Romans and those few instances in the modern world where freely organized communities have been able to determine their own purpose shines through in this work in contrast to totalitarianism. Totalitarianism isolates everyone and forces them to question themselves. The ancient republics and some of their modern, often short-lived analogs encourage us to come together, to communicate with each other, to treat ourselves as free and equal and capable of determining our own lives. And we need both the category of action and structured space for action to take place. And so I'm suggesting that the human condition grows out of problems that the origin of totalitarianism suggests. The second two books that I'm going to pair with each other, perhaps the book that Arendt is most famous for, is Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I want to be as clear as possible. Arendt, by the time she writes this book, which is the early 1960s, I imagine many of you are already aware that Adolf Eichmann was the so-called architect of the final solution, not in the sense that it was his idea, it was Hitler's and his immediate circle of Nazi leadership, but in the sense that once they decided that they were going to try to exterminate all European Jews, they needed to work out the logistics of it. We're talking about millions of people dispersed across dozens of countries. How do you get them all to death camps? How do you make the death camps operate efficiently? And by the way, if you shoot them, you end up using the bullets you need for the front line to kill the Jews. And I'm sorry to talk about this in such a distant way. Obviously, these are incredibly distressing things I'm describing. I'm just trying to, in a sense, give you a window into how Eichmann approached it, which is that this was just a logistical problem. First, we needed to put the death camps close enough to where the Jews were. Then they needed to get the trains running in the right direction at the right time to be able to transport the Jews to the death camp. Then they needed things like the famous gas showers of Auschwitz to be able to exterminate large numbers of people efficiently, right? And this is what Eichmann is responsible for. Eichmann escapes Nazi Germany, is eventually tracked down by Israel, hiding in Argentina, returned to Jerusalem to stand trial. And Arendt at this point is sufficiently prominent in the intellectual life of America that she is assigned to cover Eichmann's trial by the New Yorker. She writes a series of articles, which she then edits and collects into this very influential book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I imagine you can't see the subtitle on the slide, it's very small, but the subtitle is a report on the banality of evil. And that subtitle really captures the very controversial thesis of this book, which is that Eichmann was, in a sense, an everyman bureaucrat. He was not a monstrous Nazi steeped in the ideology of Adolf Hitler. He defended himself, and Arendt thought he was being sincere by saying, I was just doing my job, I was just following orders. But more than that, that a good citizen, a good worker, a good German has a duty to obey the law and to follow their orders. And all I did was obey the law. Blame the regime, not me. And Arendt says this is more or less an accurate self-description that Eichmann is offering in his defense. And this points out a characteristic problem of modern society, that it's a society that is tightly organized around functional role playing, where the role that you play subsumes you, demands that you simply do its dictates, leaves too little room for thought. And so Arendt's ultimate description of Eichmann is that he was thoughtless. And she focuses on the fact that he spoke in cliches, that he used these ready-made phrases, that he never really seemed to appreciate that in following orders, what he was doing was committing one of the most monstrous forms of mass murder that has been committed in human history, right? You know, didn't even occur to him to think about that. And Arendt suggests this is a characteristic problem of modern society. It's not just the Nazis, not just Eichmann. We have all become less thoughtful than we should be. And this gets us to her deep concern and indictment of modern society. But before I get there, let me just point out, it gets her also to the work that she was working on at the end of her life that she did not get to complete, but nevertheless, enough of it was composed that we're able to see 2/3 of it in something resembling a finished form. The last third only exists as lecture notes, although we do read those as well. The book is called The Life of the Mind. And in The Life of the Mind, she concentrates on thinking, willing, and judgment as three central capacities that, again, she suggests we have not adequately separated from each other or thought through well enough. Marion has her hand up. Please go ahead. If you're not unmuted, are you unmuted? It looks like you are. Go ahead, Marion. Oh, you're still unmuted. I'm still muted. Can you hold your space bar down or hit that microphone icon? There you go. You're good now. I'm sorry, are you talking? Marion, I still can't hear you.
I don't think she can hear us.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what I can do to help. Marion, if it's something you can put in the, if you're hearing me, are you hearing me?
No, I'm hearing you.
Okay, did you have a question or a comment?
No, I've just lost your speech and lost your picture, but I've got it all back now.
Okay, sorry about that, and good job getting it back. I'm afraid I probably couldn't have helped very much anyway. All right, so let me continue introducing Hannah Arendt as a way of introducing the themes I want to speak with you about in the course, and so kind of bringing this all together, right? So Arendt writes two books, The Human Condition and The Life of the Mind, in order to address two things she's concerned about growing out of the middle of the 20th century, a totalitarian society and a murderous bureaucrat who seemed not even to appreciate the degree of his complicity with one of the most monstrous evil campaigns of human history. And she suggests that there's an overall problem here, that modern thought lacks the categories to adequately think itself. We've become a relatively thoughtless society. We don't spend enough time, energy, creativity on thinking about the value of and nature of thought itself. And at the same time, she suggests that modern society lacks the organized space for the cultivation of thought and judgment. And that previous societies, whether it's in monasteries or universities or marketplaces or cafes or homes, had created spaces where people dedicated themselves to the work of thinking critically, thinking reflectively, and holding themselves to account, using their own critical capacity to reflect upon their lives, their values, their enterprises, to see if they were doing what they should be doing with their time, their energy, their resources themselves. And she suggests that the results of a society that lacks both category and organized space for thought and action can be monstrous, that Eichmann is the exemplar of thoughtlessness, that the Nazi regime is the epitome of a society to organize to produce isolation and to disorganize judgment. And my suggestion to you is that in the 50, 60 years since Arendt wrote these books and express these concerns, the organized space and intellectual resources for sustaining thinking have not been restored. We've not risen to Arendt's challenge. And the way to express this, I'm going to share with you a quote from Cicero from the Republic, or on the Republic, where he's quoting Cato the Elder. And again, I think the Rodin sculpture kind of captures this. He says, "Never is man more active than when he does nothing. Never is he less alone than when he is by himself." And so I think this is suggesting, on the one hand, that if we really are finding organized space that demands thought and eventually action, and by the way, I think Arendt thinks that action is only successful when it is thoughtful, right? When we are by ourselves thinking critically, we are preparing ourselves for activity. This is not mere boredom, but we may have to go through the stage of boredom to get to the place where we spend our time in thoughtfulness. And similarly, that when we are thinking, this is not an isolated activity, even if it is an activity that requires a space of solitude, because we have internalized dialogue partners that we use to structure our internal dialogues, our thought, our conversations. And to put the worry then in a 21st century form, the person who every time they have a moment to themselves, they're standing in the line at the grocery store, they're stuck in traffic, they're walking through the forest, immediately pulls out their phone, puts their earbuds in, starts listening to something or doing something or checking on their social media accounts, is not leaving space or time for thoughtfulness. That the worries that Arendt had are being amplified, not addressed. And then the final impetus for thinking about this now is that we stand on the cusp of, I want to say, a further acceleration and deepening of these trends, a world in which we will regularly react with an alien intelligence. And speaking, of course, of the recent breakthroughs in artificial intelligence. And just as our phones have become our ubiquitous companions that may be crowding out the space for solitude and thought, I would suggest that as AI gets more capable, the phones are going to become more and more interactive and addictive, and they're going to demand more and more of our time. And then pretty soon they're not going to be phones. They're going to be built into our glasses, or chips that are installed in our brains, or things that we wear on our body that understand and assist us without us having to have the mediation of the phone in the hand, right? And at the same time that we're experiencing what Arendt called unworlding. And that is that we are no longer part of the world that is immediately around us. As opposed to that, we're transported by our technology to a place where we don't pay much attention, don't attach much critical thought to what is right in front of our noses immediately around us. All right, so with that as the second motivation, let me now try to provide a little bit of the overview that I wanted to provide for you today. And I want to do this by talking about two different, if you will, trees or genealogies, two different historical trajectories for thinking about thinking. The first, the one on the left, goes back at least 2,500 years in the Western tradition, probably further than that in the Vedic and other traditions. But for my purposes, I'm going to talk about it originating with ancient Greek thought, and then the way in which it was taken up by ancient Roman thinking. And these are philosophical approaches. where when we think about thinking, what we think about is the contents of our mind, whether those are the thoughts that are actually circulating through me right now, or perhaps the idea that I can get behind the superficial content of my mind to some deeper structures. But nevertheless, the method is fundamentally introspective. We study ourselves by turning thought or reason back in upon itself. And then in the history of these ideas, in a very brief way that gives us, I hope, a little bit of organizational structure at the same time that it makes a very complex discourse rather simple. I'm going to suggest that we have a long history of what I'm calling foundationalist philosophy, where Plato and Aristotle exemplify the idea that we try to get some fundamental insight into the nature of things that then allows us to have solid fundamental knowledge, the truth with capital T's, on which we can build all other secure knowledge, right? And for Plato, this is the intellect or the mind understanding a higher or metaphysical reality. For Aristotle, this is still a metaphysical enterprise, but now it's understanding the telos, or the end of things themselves as we encounter them in the world, and that these ideas of Plato and Aristotle are taken up by the Romans and eventually integrated into Christian theology and dominate classical and medieval philosophy for, let us say, 1500 years roughly. And that then we begin with Descartes and Hobbes to escape from the foundationalist tradition, but Descartes and Hobbes still maintain the foundationalist aspiration. There is one essential truth or some essential insight that will allow us to ground all other knowledge securely. Among the features of this approach is that true knowledge does not depend on the perspective of the knower, but somehow gets us a God's eye perspective, or the perspective of the universe, hence a perspectivity. And the way to escape your particular perspective and gain access to the towering heights of the perspective of the universe or God is through metaphysics, right? Through escaping the senses and what they deliver to us in terms of knowledge of the physical world. Ontology, where again, that's a loaded philosophical term for understanding the nature of being itself. We penetrate the appearance, the phenomena, and capture the essence, the noumena, and that philosophy allows us somehow to get past the show that the world displays to the senses and to the essence of things, and that this in turn allows us to have secure, grounded self-knowledge. Now, the work of Descartes and Hobbes to reconstruct this tradition on new grounds is probably more destructive than constructive. What they really give rise to is modern skepticism, and this eventually gives rise to new philosophical traditions that I want to refer to as post-foundational traditions. And I'm going to pay attention to two main traditions, an empiricist and a transcendental tradition. The empiricist tradition says, look, there's no getting past our senses, right? Everything that we know, we learn through the way in which our sensory equipment processes the world. We've got no other access to the world. So our eyes, our touch, our hearing, our smelling, our taste, that's what we've got. And we've got to figure out if that's enough to get us reasonably secure knowledge, and Locke and Hume agree that we are sensory beings, although they reach somewhat different conclusions about whether the knowledge that the senses get us should be taken as adequate or not. And the frustration, the sense that the empiricist grounding of knowledge is insufficient gives rise, especially in the great 18th century Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant, to what's sometimes called the transcendental school or transcendental idealism. That was Kant's own term for his approach to philosophy. And here the idea is that reason can study itself, and in so doing, transcend the limits of empirical knowledge and get us genuine, secure knowledge, but not by somehow gaining access to a metaphysical world, but by reason's study of itself understood as a natural capacity of the human animal, given the kinds of brains we have. And so this then, and I'll concentrate on Kant next week, gives us, he thinks, some transcendental deductions of categories and laws that are not simply derived from experience, and that's the best we can hope for. This in turn gives rise to a final major branch of the tree of the history of philosophy, and that is the phenomenological branch. And this says that Kant's effort to transcend the limits of reason through turning reason in upon itself don't work. That the empiricists are right, but that the effort of philosophy should be the kind of philosophy that Kant gave us, to turn the mind in upon itself, but allowing us in so doing only to reflect on the nature of our own experience of the world. Depending on who we're talking about, Hegel and Heidegger are much more metaphysical and ontological, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty less ontological or metaphysical. And then finally, coming into the contemporary moment, we get some postmodern or deconstructive approaches that basically say this whole business was ultimately nothing but self-contradictory, and the best thing philosophy can do is pull it apart and show those contradictions as a kind of therapy, a kind of effort to make sure that we don't fall into the traps of metaphysical ambition again. And then alternatively, an approach that I'm referring to as an intersubjective approach that says that the way philosophy gets out of the contradictions and traps of the tradition is by noticing that those contradictions stem from the limits of the model of the isolated individual as the locus of thought. That thought is not in the individual, it is primarily in between us. What is the category that we use when we think it's language? Where does language come from? Not from any individual. Obviously, none of us creates our own language on our own. It comes from our culture, our society, our interactions, the way in which we internalize what we learn from each other, and that understanding philosophy is having this more sociological, anthropological dimension to it, in addition to the philosophical dimension, allows us to escape the problems without falling into pure deconstruction, pure efforts to undo the tradition. We can extend the tradition if we understand it correctly. The other approach, which we'll turn to a couple weeks from now, is what I'm calling an objectivating approach. And here, the fundamental jumping off place is a methodological critique of philosophy that says, well, in trying to turn the mind in upon itself and using introspection, you're assuming that what makes the mind work is actually available to us consciously, or if we use the right method. And if it turns out that the majority of the processes that structure our thinking and reasoning are not consciously available, that try as we may, as methodologically sophisticated as we get, they will nevertheless escape detection because they are below the threshold of consciousness, then we need other approaches. And one way to think about this is, it's like trying to understand how a car works without ever opening the hood. I've got my hands on the wheel and my foot on the gas, and that's all I need to understand. And the suggestion is no, you actually need to understand what's going on in the brain. And what's going on in the brain is electrochemical, not cognitive and intentional. Another approach to this says, well, maybe we don't necessarily need to understand everything that's happening at the cellular level in the brain, but it's still the case that an awful lot that structures what's going on in the brain is just not consciously accessible to us. Think about Freud's emphasis on the unconscious. And so the 19th century approaches are, I think, interesting historically, but I won't spend a lot of time on them. The Freudian approach, I will spend a little bit of time on, given its strong influence, the long shadow that it casts. Then I'll start to get to behaviorism. And again, I'll be relatively quick in thinking about behaviorism, but the idea that the mind is a black box that we don't need to understand, that what matters is the way in which stimuli lead us to behave. And if you can understand the way in which we respond to stimuli, then you've understood the brain and mind scientifically. And each of those approaches, which between them take up most of the 19th and 20th centuries, I think has been deeply superseded by contemporary approaches. There are not too many contemporary Freudians or behaviorists left, but they have given rise to new approaches that I think are really important. So we'll spend some time on the dual process approach to psychology, which suggests that the vast majority of what we do with our brains occurs unconsciously, but relies on heuristics that allow us to solve problems and reduce complexity. And on the other hand, the idea of embodied cognition and brain science, that to really understand where the mind is and how it works, you need to recognize that it's physically located in the brain and the body, and we need to study the structures and operations of the physical architecture of the mind to really understand the mind, reduce the mind to the structure of the brain. All right, so that's where we're going. I'm wondering, I'm hoping that you may have some questions or thoughts about all of this, and that could be about what I've shared with you from Hannah Arendt, or about the overall organization of ideas, or about the purpose of the class. Anybody want to start us off? Flossie, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, as I'm sure you are aware. Oh, I think you turned your camera off.
Now?
Yes, you got it.
What you're talking about, to me, has a lot to do with good teaching.
Yeah, and
the idea of somebody in authority, not consciously, but often without being conscious of it, having the final word on where another mind is going. It seems to me that in good teaching, there is an exchange of minds.
Yeah, Flossie, thank you for that. And so I suppose it's no accident that I studied at a university where we used the tutorial system, and then I ended up teaching at a college where we do one-on-one work with our students. And I do think this idea that you have to model thinking and you have to evoke it. It doesn't just happen spontaneously, that you need a culture and a context that encourages people to think for themselves. That what Arendt was saying about Eichmann is, in essence, and I don't know, Duchamp's ready-mades, I think, if you're looking at this from an artistic perspective, have something of the same idea, that we're often all too happy to fall into received patterns of thought, that thinking for yourself is hard work. And while it is ultimately rewarding, it can also be head spinning and exhausting. And so developing these capacities require encouragement, cultivation, organized space. And yes, that education, whether it's formal or informal, right? I can't imagine that I would be the person I am, but for the encouragement that I got from my parents and from other relatives and then teachers and then friends, right? It takes an overall milieu that brings this out in the person. And I think part of Arendt's worry, and my worry too, is that those milieus are increasingly threatened. Even the nice little liberal arts college that I teach at, where I think we've made a real career out of emphasizing this approach to pedagogy, is more and more feeling the need to market itself as delivering saleable services, stuff that's going to help you in the marketplace. And that's very different from the historical understanding that we had. David, you've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead, and then I'll come to you, Iris.
Sure. I appreciate the two column tree branching diagram with philosophical and what was the other one? Objectifying or whatever approaches.
Good.
But are you open to the possibility that there's some seepage across that boundary? For example, in the last 10 years, I've encountered quite a bit in my own field on the embodied cognition business, but the people who write about a field called the science of learning and development accept the interface between what goes on in the cognition and the physical structures of mind, as well as some of these things being seated in other parts of the body, like the stomach and things like that. But they also almost always bring in physical and cultural and social context into their deliberations. And that falls more under the intersubjectivity side and the like. So is this dichotomy, can it be bridged? Can people move across it? Because in order to make that work for me, I'd have to bridge between intersubjectivity and embodied cognition.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. And this is actually exactly where I intend to start next week, which is to say that I think both of these camps tend to fall into the trap of viewing their approach as mutually exclusive with the other approach and thinking that they've got to win, right? They've got to demonstrate the superiority of their approach, as opposed to thinking that each of these approaches has insight and value, but that ultimately they can be integrated. And I'll just give one example, right? I had William James on the objectivating side for his initial work in psychology. And, you know, James is one of the pioneers, among other things, of the method of free association to try to get at what's going on in the mind without the fact that we are the ones reflecting on ourselves, altering what we're reflecting on, right? The doubling of the subject of knowledge, as it's sometimes called. And James is a psychologist, right? But he's also a pragmatist and a philosopher, right? And so yes, even people sometimes can be well described under both categories at once. And I think the most interesting contemporaries, people like Chomsky, are definitely doing both at the same time. There's no reason not to draw on both methods. Yeah, so good comment, and very much anticipating where I'm going.
Right.
Some of you may have seen the bet that was recently settled between a brain scientist and a philosopher, where the brain scientist bet that 25 years ago we would have a adequate reductive account of consciousness where we could get rid of philosophical accounts, right? And he just conceded to David Chalmers that Chalmers had won the bet, right? That brain science had not got us an adequate explanation of consciousness. Chalmers is one of these people, I think, who works very much at the intersection of the two fields and is very interesting, therefore. All right, Iris, go ahead.
Yes.
I caught you as soon as you pulled a tissue out. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you. I have been thinking hard about the fact that our human condition is so often dominated by our emotional condition. Part of what has happened is that we have gone beyond the ability to see ourselves as part of the animal kingdom, as part of the larger universe of living entities. And this has strengthened our sense of superiority and destroyed our ability to see ourselves as part of the larger forces of nature. I think we've got to have another category for philosophy that will begin to look at our place in the universe of animal and plant kingdom. Thoughtful entities expressing themselves differently, but very wisely for the survival of the continent of the world. We haven't gotten there yet. We're still talking about nuclear annihilation as if we're in control of all the buttons. So I'm wondering if we might think about a new philosophy. Don't have a name for it yet.
Well, and that's wonderful, Iris. And in listening to you, I'm hearing certain themes that I think are going to come up over the course of this series. So starting with the idea of emotion. And I don't know if you caught, but I believe David referred to the idea that some of our thinking is embodied not just in our brain, but in our guts. And it turns out that there's a pretty complicated neural mesh, a mesh of neurons and nervous tissue in the gut, and that a lot of our emotions originate in the gut, and that they're essential to the way in which we perceive and understand the world, right? And so that would be one effort to kind of damp down the ambitions of a narrowly rationalistic, we're all about our rationality and our reason. No, our emotions are really important. And by the way, they originate not in the brain, but in the gut. And then I think there's another question here that your comment is raising, and that is complicated, interesting, fun. And that is, how far do we naturalize ourselves? We are animals, right? We are primates. We are hominids. We have evolved, and our brains have evolved. And by the way, they've retained aspects of other brains that evolved a long time ago. We have lizard brains inside our hominid brains, right? And so on the one hand, that should inspire a certain humility, as well as a certain sympathy or compassion for the rest of the natural world. And on the other hand, I want to suggest we have to be careful, or at least I think we have to be careful about naturalism run amok, which says all we are is the chemical processes in our brains. We're just animals governed by laws, and ultimately we will understand all those laws. I think one of the things I'm learning from my efforts to understand artificial intelligence is how little we understand about how our brains work, and how there seem to be emergent properties of our brains that really can't be so far explained in terms of the architecture of our brains. And I don't know if you want to call that something spiritual, or if you just want to call that something non-reducible. But whatever way you want to refer to it, I don't want to go so far down the naturalistic path that I think ultimately I should be able to explain everything about me just through what's going on in the electrochemical processes between the neurons in my brain. So thank you for that, Iris. And we'll be coming back to some of these themes. We could do one more question or comment if anyone has one. Good. David wants to come back in again. Go ahead.
Well, just a suggestion based on what you just said. Am I on?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you want to see a theatrical portrayal of some of these issues, particularly the introspection part, go see the play the one-man play that just started at Berkeley Rep, Out of Character. It's all about this guy's, conversations with his inner evil self, and it's very great on this business of introspection and self analysis and the like. But it's very, very good. The best thing I've seen all year at Berkeley Rep.
Interesting. How long is it running? I won't be out there.
I think it just started recently. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it runs for most of the month.
Well,
David, may I ask about previous focus on understanding the mind?
mm-hmm.
Does that lead us into a trap that we don't understand? We're not willing to look beyond the mind. So we fill our AI with mindful knowledge that comes out of our own narrow perspectives on things. And then we say, this will be the ultimate in problem solving. Are we in a trap?
Well, so let me try to answer that question briefly for today. What is it we ask artificial intelligence to do? Essentially, we ask it to do things that we recognize as intelligence, right? And so what do we recognize as intelligence? The way our own minds work to solve problems, right? Or to structure reasoning, or to construct meaning, right? We could go through the array, but so far, what we're doing with artificial intelligence is, I think you're absolutely right, in a sense, trying to replicate human intelligence. And we're really at the design level, if I understand it correctly, working with neural networks that try to replicate the way in which our neurons are structured. So this was the big breakthrough in artificial intelligence, first 25 and then around a dozen years ago, is getting better and better approximations of neural networks housed in computers as opposed to housed in brains, that have allowed these rapid advances in artificial intelligence right now. But I do think one of the big questions will be, how alien will the intelligence that we've made ultimately be, right? Will it begin not just to think for itself, but to think differently from the way we think? And what will it mean for us? I do think, going back to your first comment, Iris, we're rather bad at recognizing intelligence in animals, or maybe even the intelligence of other cultures that don't seem to adhere to our models, right? What's going to happen once artificial intelligence starts thinking for itself? And I think there's the nightmare scenario, which is that it is more powerful, it's a super intelligence, and it has aims that don't converge with ours, and then we're in trouble, right? And the other scenario, I think, which is maybe the more philosophically interesting scenario, is no, it's not out to master us or pursuing aims that ultimately disempower us. It's just different from us. And how do we understand it? And so some of the ethical speculation on this is we don't have a good history of treating sentient life well, right? And if artificial intelligence becomes sentient, as opposed to worrying about what it does to us, maybe we should be a little worried about what we will do to it. All right, I think that's a good, fun note to end on today. Wonderful as always being with you, and looking forward to continuing these conversations in the weeks to come. Take care, everyone. Be well, and I do hope the virus comes under control there quickly and that you'll be out and about together again soon. Take care. Bye, guys.